Hello, BookTube. Well, as I mentioned, I'm up in Vermont, but our read-alongs must continue. And I like to pack light wherever I go, anywhere. I like to pack light. Nothing's more depressing than lugging suitcases to go somewhere. So when I was packing to come up here, I did not bring either book. I'm coming to a house that's crammed with books, and the library collection in this house is that of an old school science fiction and fantasy fan. So I knew that there would be copies of both our read-along books. So I didn't pack them. And that's the only problem with that, is that in my books I had a couple of passages marked to read out to you, but you can do without my my flat nasal reading for 1 week. And when we're doing read-alongs on this channel of Children of Dune by Frank Herbert and The Power That Preserves by Stephen R. Donaldson. And I was dismayed when I got up here to find out that my prediction was 1/2 wrong. The collection in this little farmhouse did not have The Power That Preserves, so I had to go to the local library. It's some sort of dump. It's basically just 2 planks in the middle of a field that have some books put on them. And they had a copy of The Power That Preserves. I checked it out, but the head librarian is a little sketchy. I'm not sure I'll go back. I'll probably just drive by the place and hurl the book at the checkout. But it's this hideous reprint of the Thomas Covenant stories that have this horrible artwork. Some of you who've been reading science fiction and fantasy for a while will remember that dark period in all our lives when this cover artist somehow got work everywhere, even though that is dull, gray, and static. I guess if I'm vilifying this person, I should say who they are. Who is this cover artist? Can't stand them. And there's Michael Herring is his name. And an actual Herring out of the North Atlantic could do a better job. So, but we'll take what we can do. We'll take what we did for this time around. And today we're going to do, right now, for this video, we're going to do the first of our read-along of The Power That Preserves, which is the 3rd book in the First Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. Me and a few other booktubers are doing a read-along of the first 6 books of Thomas Covenant by Stephen R. Donaldson, starting in July and going all the way to December, 1 book a month. But as you'll remember from Lord Foulsbane and the Ill-Earth War, I'm doing a read-along as well, so I'm breaking these things up. This thing is, we're doing about 5 chapters a week of The Power That Preserves. And those of you who are joining the party late, this is the story of a man named Thomas Covenant, who is from our world. He's from the normal world, although the problem that comes to him in our normal world is something out of a novel. It's so unheard of in the present day. He contracts leprosy, and he ignores it at first. He's a celebrated best-selling author, and he's sort of futzing around and pecking at his new book, and ignores his disease to the point where even once it's discovered and he's given self-care routines and medication, he still loses 2 fingers on one hand. And his wife leaves him, and she takes their kid. So he is, in Lord Foulsbane, the first book in this series, he's a bitter guy. He's not only sick with a disease that has no cure, it's cost him the feeling in his hands and feet, it's cost him his virility, and it's locked him into this self-centeredness of his disease, where he has to pay attention to it all the time, or it will go out of control. It's a leper's existence. It's a leper's world that he's in. And in Lord Foulsbane, the first book in this series, he collapses and finds and wakes up in a fantasy place called the Land, an agrarian fantasy land full of earth magic, full of magical beings, giants and wizards, and an evil being named Lord Foul, who wants to destroy it all. And because of the nature of his leper's existence in our world, Thomas Covenant doesn't believe the land is real. That is one of the governing conceits of these early books in this series, is that he won't cede the land reality. He won't believe it, especially since it looks tailor-made to undercut his leper's worldview. It looks exactly like the kind of fantasy that a leper would have if he went out of his mind. A place where everyone's healthy. A place where everyone is so healthy that they can actually see the health of each other. With their eyes, they can see it. And a place that, as Covenant learns in the course of that first book, a place where nerves can regenerate. A place where if you eat the local food and you use there's a kind of mud that heals wounds, you can reverse leprosy. He starts to feel his extremities again, and he also starts to get his virility back, and that leads to a detail in Lord Foulsbane that I was sure that it was going to break this read along. I've tried many times to interest people in this series, and the further along in time we go, the more sexually and socially enlightened our society becomes to questions like power imbalances or rape, the less justifiable on any level Lord Foulsbane is, because in the course of that book, when Thomas Covenant is starting to get feeling back in this place that he thinks is a fantasy, he rapes a preteen girl named Lena, and he's bitter anyway, and he regrets a lot, but it doesn't seem in the context of that book as if Donaldson considers it to be one of his major crimes. Whenever Covenant or any other character in Lord Foulsbane, and even in the Illirith War, even well into the second book, whenever any character, Covenant or otherwise, are cataloging his sins, that either comes up late in the list or doesn't come up at all, and that leads me to think that it's Donaldson who didn't rank it as high as it could do. But we got over it in the Illirith War. We got over the concentration on that to some degree, because I think on some level Donaldson understood that his character, Thomas Covenant, wasn't just an anti-hero, that he was a monster, someone who's not just, bitter, but also hateable. So in the Illirith War, Donaldson splits the narrative focus quite a bit. We get stories told from all corners of the land that have nothing to do with Covenant, and the narrative itself splits. Covenant goes off with the High Lord of the wizards that govern the land, and the rest of the characters go off to war, and the book splits that narrative evenly, so we don't spend a lot of time around Covenant, is what I'm saying. And it worked. That, I think, definitely works. It takes the sting out of spending time with Covenant, too much time with Covenant, by giving us more of the land. And I think it also frees up Donaldson's creativity. The more he spends time away from Covenant, the more of his original creations in the land we get to see. The first book, Lord Foulsbane, is all Thomas Covenant all the time, and is, I think, not unconnectedly, the most Tolkien-esque book. And then, as we meet other people and spend more time with other people, that softens quite a bit. And that happens in the Illirith War, and it happens even more in this third volume. Now, at the end of the Illirith War, Thomas, in the second book in the series, Covenant, at the end of Lord Foulsbane, he goes back to his own world, and he believes that, this could easily have been a fantasy. This could easily not have been real, no matter how real it seemed to me. And he realizes at the end of that book that time passes much swifter in the land than it does in our world. So just a few days elapse between the end of events in Lord Foulsbane and the beginning of events in the Illirith War, and yet 40 years have passed in the land. And then at the end of that book, Covenant summoning ends, and he ends up back in our world, and that's where this book begins. And if readers thought that Thomas Covenant had hit rock bottom in our world in the Illirith War, they were wrong, because he really hits rock bottom in the opening chapters of this book. In fact, Donaldson delays Covenant's arrival in the land in this book so long that he isn't actually there in the chapters that we're reading today. He hasn't actually got there yet. And right away, right from the beginning of the book, the narrative focus is split. So we don't have to spend all this time cooped up with Thomas Covenant. But in his world, he has a bad cut on his forehead. In the Illirith War, he falls and hits his head on the coffee table. And in our world, he hasn't treated it. He ignores his medication. He tears apart his bookcases. He just bottoms out in the farm that he has in the outskirts of town. Mainly, you get the impression because the second time around, in the Illirith War, the land felt much realer to him. When it ends, he feels like he's missed something, like something has actually happened to him. It's no longer possible by that point for Covenant to believably say, this is just a delusion, and I shouldn't give it any weight. That's no longer possible for him or us. And it's not just that he bottoms out in his own home, it's also that his excursions out into the world to go to a nightclub in the Illith War has got the town near where his house is all up in arms. They were uncomfortable with having a leper living near them anyway. But a leper who's going to break the unspoken compact and go out among them unannounced, that gets people very angry. There is, at the beginning of this book, Covenant's lawyer tells him that there is a movement afoot to get him dispossessed from his home and put out on the street, have the place rezoned so that he can't live there. And in addition to that, Covenant has his food delivered to his house. The town delivers his groceries to his house so that they won't run the risk of him coming into town. And at the beginning of this book, he sees a delivery of groceries. This is the same as any other time, and he hasn't eaten in days. He has a suppurating wound on his forehead, and he decides to just bite into a loaf of bread, and someone has put a rusty razor blade in the loaf of bread, and he cuts the inside of his mouth. So he has this huge wound on his forehead, and there's blood caked around his mouth. And as if that weren't bad enough, we're still not done. He still decides to go out and about. He decides to go out again. He's adamant to meet people because he is no longer in the land. That is my reading anyway, that what's driving him to go out and meet people is that he has had these adventures and he can't call them unreal. He goes to, it's actually a wonderful scene. He goes to a tent revival religious meeting with an oily preacher up at the front, working the crowd for donations and whatnot, and saying, "Oh, my brothers and sisters, come and give yourself to the Lamb. Come, walk up the aisle and confess your sins," when it's all theater. And the last thing that oily preacher is expecting is that an actual leper, straight out of the Old Testament, is going to come walking up the aisle and say, "I'm a leper, help me." And it's a wonderful moment because the preacher is sure that somebody put this guy up to it, and he can see the wound on Covenant's forehead. And when it comes to the moment, Covenant cannot be untrue to his own nature, and he says, "I don't believe." He has well and truly he has earned the name that is given to him by the inhabitants of the land, unbeliever. And he's run off from there, but it just gets worse, because when he's in the woods near his property, he sees a little girl who is frozen with terror. And when he looks on the ground, he sees a rattlesnake poised to bite her. And of course he wants to help, but he hasn't eaten in days. He's as weak as could be. He's got wounds of his own. He is running towards her when suddenly the worst possible thing from his point of view happens. He is summoned to the land. He starts to vanish from the rocks and trees where he is running to help this girl. Because a character from the first two books, Lord Moram, one of Stephen R. Donaldson's best fictional creations, in the 9 years or 7 years since the end of the Illith War in the land, Moram has become High Lord. He now rules the covenant of the group of lords at Revelstone, and is settling Revelstone for a massive siege by another gigantic army sent by Lord Fowl to destroy the land. Much has changed in the land. Of course, the end of the Illith War saw not only the downfall of the previous High Lord, but the loss of the Staff of Law, which the lords had and which was an amazingly powerful mystical instrument, and is now gone. Whereas Lord Fowl has just gotten stronger, and his armies have just gotten stronger. He has co-opted giants to lead his army. You see a giant on the cover here. Giants are pure, adventurous creatures. They are one of Donaldson's greatest fictional creations. We'll see that in the second trilogy. But Lord Fowl's power, plus the power of this mystical thing called the Illith Stone that he is using, has allowed him, plus to co-opt giants to lead his armies. And he's helped in that by his three greatest servants, these bodiless creatures called ravers, who can take over a body of something. And as we're told over and over again, a raver could never possess a giant. And the Illith Stone could never coerce a giant. But those two things together are enough. And so there are giants leading the army there's a giant leading the army that is besieging Revelstone. So Lord Moram figures, the only hope that we have here is to summon Thomas Covenant back to the land. And you might wonder, well, why would they care about a leper from our world? But Thomas Covenant has a white gold wedding ring that, even though his wife has left him, he refuses to take it off. And white gold is unknown in the land and has massive mystical power. Another Tolkien echo. but it gets more fleshed out as these books go on. It stops being a Tolkien echo and starts to take on its own originality. But that's why Moram wants to summon him. That's why he undergoes the summoning, because he figures Thomas Covenant is the land's only hope. But when Covenant starts to appear, Moram and all the other lords in the conclave get a look at him. And he's got a gigantic, infected wound on his forehead. His mouth is caked with blood. They can see that he hasn't eaten in days, that he looks delirious. Moram actually says to him, your world is a hell. The question for the people of the land is, what on earth goes on over in your world? And this is what you look like when we summon you. And Covenant says, no, you can't summon me now. That girl needs help. I'm the only one nearby. I have to help her. And they have a bit of a tense debate about it, brief but tense. And Moram makes a perfect decision, a perfectly in character decision for Lord Moram. He lets him go. He says, yes, I believe the white gold is the only hope for the land's survival, but we will not coerce our salvation. You have to help us willingly. And it sounds like a life in your world depends on it. We will not buy our survival at that cost. It's a bitter, hard-won note of real-world heroism. There's nothing like it in the Ill-Earth War. There's nothing like it in Lord Foulsbane, and it fills this book. It is something I'm going to, in the course of our read-along, I'm going to recommend that note. Donaldson, I don't know anything about his personal life, but he hits that note perfectly. And at the end of this book, gives it a scene of vindication, the like of which I have not seen in any fantasy story. So we'll be getting to that. But for today, we'll just continue with these early chapters. Moram sends Covenant back. He rematerializes in the forest. He rushes over to the girl. By this point, she has been bitten by the snake. And Covenant does a couple of things that you really, really shouldn't do in that moment. It's a popular myth that if you're bitten by a rattlesnake, you should take a penknife, cut an incision near the wound, and suck out the venom. That doesn't work. That is a bad idea to do. I don't know how it became a popular myth, probably from pop culture westerns or whatever. But Donaldson didn't know that. So he has Covenant cut the girl's leg, make an incision, and suck out the venom. And that is wrong in two ways. One, that doesn't work. It's a good way to get yourself sick, but it doesn't help the victim at all. And two, the one thing, back when Donaldson was writing these books, one of the only things that was known about the presentation of leprosy is that children are vulnerable to it, and that you can definitely give it to them by sharing blood with them. And Covenant has a bloody mouth. He's almost certainly condemning this girl to leprosy. And you're watching the scene because, he's half out of his mind with delirium and hunger, and he's acting out of heroism. This is the Covenant we wish we had seen more of in the previous two books. It's just he's doing it all wrong. But right after he does that, and the girl is very brave. Donaldson writes all of these real world people really well. It makes you wonder what an ordinary novel of his would have been like without any fantasy elements. But Covenant picks up the girl in an attempt to walk her back to her parents. And he eventually does that, even though he's a ghost. He's just a wraith with weakness. And then he is summoned again to the land. He gets the girl back home, and he manages to croak out to her parents that she's been bitten by a rattlesnake, because she's so upset that she isn't telling her parents that. And then he is summoned to the land again, but it's not Lord Moram who does it. Lord Moram has already told his fellow lords, we can't summon him again. He might not be done saving the person who needed saving. No, it's a group of other people who summon Covenant to the land, and we'll talk about them next time. They succeed. They work real hard at it, and they get him into the land. But you can see right there, that means that the Lord Moram story of the Siege of Revelstone will be completely different from Covenant. Lord Moram doesn't even know that Covenant is in the land for the whole course of this book. So that's what we're going to have for our next 3 weeks. We're going to have two different stories to talk about. And I'm hoping, those of you who stuck around through the first two books, I'm hoping that you really enjoy this book. I'm going to help you to really enjoy it, because I think Covenant is more bearable in this book. And there's a story of doomed heroism in here that is really memorable. So we'll wrap this up for now, but that we'll be continuing. We'll do the next 5 chapters next week. So I will resume next Sunday when I'll be right here in the little farmhouse. Don't tell my host, but I'm not going anywhere. So I'll just keep using it. Oh. He's reaching for the family shotgun. It had a dusty place on the mantelpiece, but now it's bright and shiny. They reach for it all the time. But I'll wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you.